I think as we sort of kick things off, Kylie, I'll come to you first if I can. I welcomed you on stage first, so I'll come to you first as well. Tell us a little about your role at PwC. I'm kind of interested in what the role entails. And I think given that role particularly, maybe share some of your views on a human-centered security design, which we talked about earlier on when we had that conversation before today's session.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So some of you may have seen there was a bit of a media splash when I went over to PwC, but I really focused, and I do focus on the human side of cybersecurity. So I'm what we call a cyber sociologist. So I studied cybersecurity. I've also studied sociology, and my real focus is on the human side of things. So to give you an example of that, your security operations centers. So when you're looking at those from an optimization perspective, a lot of the time you're looking at the technology side of it. I will be going in and looking at the people and the process side of it as well. When you're looking, and it was mentioned earlier this morning about biases and what I like to call group think, and I look around the room and I see there might be a little bit of group think going on, and when I go out to site I see that too. I look at biases. So things like affinity bias, are you employing people similar to yourself? Are you all sort of going, oh yeah, we've picked this vendor, I've worked with this vendor for the last 10 years, so I trust this vendor, and sticking with that only because of that trust? Or are you actually really going out there and thinking through those biases and listening to the diverse opinions that are out there? So I cover everything from your offense and the defense side of it. I also happen to be a cyber criminologist, so I write a number of articles on, the actual threat vectors, who they are, why they do what they do, the motivations behind that. So just one last thing in terms of, really key to tell you what really frustrates me, and the thing I do the most is when there's a breach, when there's an attack, the CISO is usually so focused on the executive and the board and on the security operations center that they forget the citizen and the consumer. So quite often you'll then find things like class actions and things arising, as we're seeing at the moment in the media, because you're really trying, you're absolutely flooded, you've got so much going on and you're just trying to focus on those few things. But actually the thing that really matters from the human side of it is the citizen or the customer. So I usually get in there and help and assist with that and get you to not have to do it yourself, and I can get in there and help you with that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kylie. You made one of the points up there earlier on about the sort of vendor selection, that sort of thing as well. And one thing which totally drives me mad is when I hear I'm an XYZ shop, right? That kind of mindset is that there's still a lot of that thinking out there as well. So that's interesting. Alan, let me come to you now. I'd really love to get a sense of, what does a day in the life of Alan look like, in your role there? What's your role actually entailed? And I guess building on some of Kylie's comments, how important really is it to sort of expand that cyber discussion beyond business, to the citizen level as well in terms of those conversations?
Thanks, Matt. I think for those that don't know, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre sits within the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD. So ASD is Australia's oldest intelligence agency. We celebrated our 75th year last year. And we, as in the ACSC, we put out, we do a number of programs, a number of activities focused around providing advisories, guidance and advice for whole of economy, not just for government. We do it for critical infrastructure and obviously end users. We provide annual threat reports, and we also have a number of programs, a 24/7 incident management watch, and sort of looking at the whole of economy. My day job is looking after Cyber Uplift, so the majority of my day is working with critical infrastructure and government to give them support, assistance, guidance and resources to help them manage essentially vulnerabilities in their systems and their networks. And I think the biggest sort of things that we see day to day is actually they're generally not technical problems, they're cultural problems. And that'd probably surprise some people, but the longer I've been in the job, the more that's sort of concrete in my mind is it's a cultural issue often in organisations rather than a technical one. Just on the second thing, to bring the citizen along, I think I'll touch on it a bit later, but I think having plans is probably the key thing that has put some organisations better than others. Having the right plans in place and plans that involve both the board and how the public, managing that from a public perspective, as Kylie sort of mentioned, is highly critical from our perspective.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, Alan, isn't it? Because we spoke earlier on about the challenges we face around sort of legacy technologies, legacy processes, but we also see legacy mindsets, right, being one of those major sort of cultural challenges. And I think that's driving to, the number one cause everyone here has pretty much told us of breaches, and that's human error, right? So we don't fix the culture, we won't fix a lot of those challenges as well. All right, great. So, Tom, Internet 2.0 or 2.0, depending what side of the pond you're on. Can you tell us a bit about what is Internet 2.0 and perhaps your role there as well as it relates to the topic?
Sure. So my role is very straightforward. I'm a non-executive director there, but Internet 2.0 is a cyber software company. We have a couple of products. One is a next generation firewall. It's patented. It's defeat scanning tool. So our whole idea is that you try and hide yourself from any hackers and let that just sort of they'll go off and attack someone else. Behind that, we have a product that interrogates all the downloads and works out whether it's got malware or malicious software in it or anything else like that. We do some advanced practices, other things like that. And then you would have seen us where we sort of have a public good component to what we do as well. So you would have seen that in the TikTok report. So in last July, we put out a report on TikTok. And it's caused a little bit of a storm.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. I guess building on that, Tom, bit as well, when we spoke earlier on, we were talking about culture, things like, TikTok, for example, is a great example there as well. You said to me that security in the culture is really, it's increasingly as much about national duty, right? Because security is really about security of the country in many ways as well. So can you expand a bit more on that? When you think about that being all of our duty to really secure things effectively.
I think you've got to assess whether we have anything of value or not, right? There's no point protecting something that we don't value. So as a society, we've built a marvelous society. Western liberalism as democracy has developed these wonderful societies that we all live in, incredibly wealthy in historical terms, and they're worth protecting. But because our societies are no longer so top-down, because our wealth is largely, more spread across society than it ever has been in the past, it means that we're all interconnected into the economy and we all have a role in defending our society. And it's as simple as defending your own company because your company provides services or products or something to other people. It's a critical part of our society. And so your defense of your own company is in fact a contribution to the national defense.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot at Adapt about it needs to be almost a whole of life approach to security in many ways for citizens in general. Kylie, let me come back to you. I want to build a little bit on what we heard from Alan and Tom particularly, but there's always, if you think historically, been this sort of natural tension, if you like, with civil society and people and government, right, in terms of the tension between the two. So if I think about that, what's the government's role here, versus the individual's role? And how do we sort of get the two, if you think, more aligned as we consider that as well?
Yeah, good question. I think it's, really tricky at the moment. Has anyone seen the sovereign citizen movement?
Yeah.
Yeah? So there's significant distrust from the community to government. Like government's never really fared that well in terms of the trust indexes that they do. But we've now got this uprising, more educated people, as just mentioned before, greater wealth, people more aware of their rights. Whether you agree with it or not, significant movement, significant distrust. And then government, has this data, has this information, is collecting it, and there's this real expectation that you're going to look after it. You're not going to have it breached, that you will have the right systems, and security in place. So it's almost not a trust, but it's, you must do this. So as soon as we see a government organisation, getting breached or, subject to a malicious attack, there's significant community unrest. And we haven't really seen it, I think, yet. I think it's coming. And I think we need to be really careful of it. I think also just from that, civil society, we do expect that the right thing is going to be done. And so we do expect that government only collects certain amounts of data. And we saw the community backlashed, rightfully so, on very sensitive data being revealed, with the Medicare breach. And that can happen again with the types of data that government does collect. So we have to be really careful and think about not just government, but the organisations here, what data you actually collecting, and think about the trust that's being placed in you by that citizen or by that customer for you holding that data on them.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's a really good point. Tom, I'll bring you in now because sort of building a little bit on what Kylie is talking about. If you think about it, where are we most at risk, right? If you think, sort of peel back the onion and really think about where is the major risk for us. And I think talking more about what Kylie was saying, how do we work collectively to sort of not necessarily mitigate the risk, but manage it? Where do you see some of those biggest areas?
I'm not sure that working collectively is the answer, actually. I think,
interesting.
Everybody working towards the same goal would probably satisfy that definition, and the goal is defending yourselves. But we all know our own businesses, we all know our own networks better than anybody else, and therefore it's our responsibility as individuals and companies to take that on. So there's I suppose to answer your question, it's a dual component, isn't it? You've got the collective responsibility to all do the right thing, to all try and defend our businesses and our society, and then there's the individual component of that is, well, what's my role in that? So, I think it's hard to go past, no one wants to admit we're in a war, right? We're already in a cyber war. We are already being attacked, and everyone just wants to bury their heads and say, it's just business as normal. It's not business as normal. They are, previously when you wanted to steal someone's money, you walked in there, you kicked down the door, you put a gun in their face, and you took whatever cash you could get your hands on. Now they lock up your systems, they completely disable your business, and they take their ransom or whatever it is. So everything's changed. A lot of those ransomware actors are acting under state protection, so they're not necessarily state organisations, but they're state protected, or at least tolerated. And that's a different thing too. You've got national governments tolerating or facilitating crimes against other societies, and we have to acknowledge that is a deliberate policy action on behalf of foreign governments, and we need to take action as a result.
All right, great, thanks. So Alan, I'll bring you in now because I want to get your thoughts in terms of, we've been breached, right? We're in crisis mode, and we tend, I think, at that point to become somewhat inwardly focused when we probably need to become much more outwardly focused. And I spoke to Narelle Devine, who's the group CISO at Telstra, for example, and she said she's got a whole newfound respect for their comms teams, right? Because the importance, to Kylie's point, of communication is really, really critical. So if you think about it in your role and organisations you work with, how can we really change our thinking, if you like, around that public communication side of things to not just, I guess, inform, but I think equip and enable people as well?
Yeah, just before I start, just to go to Tom's point about the adversary. I think my day, your previous question to me around what is my day, and essentially my day is about seeing the adversary attack Australian networks every day and defeating that adversary, or whoever the adversary may be, and tying that into breaches. We see breaches every day, and the ones where we see the best management of cyber breaches are the ones that take a holistic approach to managing the issue. They bring their board along, but they also bring their customers and their consumers along. Too often, I think we see companies having legalistic approaches to managing cyber risks. They bring in its lawyers at 20 paces. And it's frustrating for us as a government agency, going back to your point earlier about trust. For us, trust is critical. We have worked very hard in the Cyber Centre to sort of build trust within the community, to be a trusted partner for organisations to pick up the phone and call us and tell us when there's an issue before they've put out an ASX release, for example. They're seeing us, if they're putting it out, if they're calling us at the same time they're putting an ASX release out, I think we've almost missed the boat as far as we're concerned. Success happens when our tech people are talking to their tech people, when our comms people are talking to their comms people, and understanding what the impact is, and how to manage it from that national interest whole of economy perspective. It is not a siloed issue; it's a whole of economy issue, particularly with large amounts of data being stored increasingly by these businesses.
Yeah, and you made that point about the trust side of things, and when we ask organisations across personas, that building a secure and trusted organisation, right, is really a major priority for them in many ways. So, I think as we consider organisations telling us that becoming data-driven, creating data-driven organisations, sort of major focuses for them. I'd love to get some thoughts. Here we are. We're breached, we're battered, we're bruised. Right? We barely know what data we have, let alone what's actually been breached. So, Kylie, I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of at what point, we talk about data being the new gold. At what point does it go from gold to mud, right, if you like, in many ways in these sort of situations?
Yeah. I would think it goes from gold to almost toxic waste. Right? I started off my career in engineering, dealing with explosives ordnance, and I would think that your data, a lot of the sets of your data is almost toxic waste or nuclear. So really, the biggest issue I see is a lot of organisations have just collected all this data because they see it as an asset. They want to be able to use it for a number of different, business use cases to improve the organisation and meet its outcomes. And yet, actually, they've collected way too much data. If I give you an example, and I will name them, anyone been on a tour or something, I've just come back from a holiday, and Viator was asking for my passport details. It wanted the expiry date. It wanted the names and birth dates of all of us just to go on a champagne tour. So, there was no ability for me to push back on that. It was all mandatory. So for me to do that, I had to enter that data. I may not have entered it as correctly as I could have from the industry I'm in, but, do they need that data? No, they don't need that data. So I'd really question the people in the audience here, what are your organisations collecting, and are you treating it appropriately? Are there sets there that are more nuclear or toxic than they really need to be? Is there data that you should have destroyed and gotten rid of, or archived, or done whatever you need to do to treat it? But do you really need it? And I also implore you as a citizen to push back a bit on some of those mandatory fields, right? Don't fill out everything because they ask for it. And I'd implore you to really think at what you're collecting in your organisation and review with your data teams, what you've actually got, because that's what's going to really get you in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks for that. All right, so when we kind of think about the breach, we think about sort of the data becoming toxic, that kind of thing. Obviously, that's when ransomware typically sort of raises its head, right, when at that point. But where does it start, Tom? That's not the start and beginning of the ransomware journey, is it?
No. Well, it starts with the reconnaissance. So the one thing that all ransomware attacks or all hacking events have in common is a reconnaissance component right at the start, looking at your network, trying to find it, trying to see what servers you are running and software behind them and everything else. I'm not a technical person, so forgive me if I use the wrong terms. You missed out on Robert. He's much better than me. So that reconnaissance component is the first thing. And that's in fact the thesis of our main product, our patented firewall, is that if we can defeat the scanning tools, they'll go somewhere else. Right? So that's where it starts. It starts in that scanning, and so part of the job, I suppose, of the technical people is to clean up their networks, to give out as little information about their networks as possible, to make it as hard as possible for those hackers and ransomware operators to see you and to attack you.
Okay, and we heard a bit of that from Michael at Village and Palo Alto as well earlier on as well around that too. All right, so I think we touched on this a little bit, Alan, but when we spoke earlier on, I talked about the challenges we face, obviously around awareness. But as we become more aware, right, we're breached, our data's out there. How do we stop complacency really creeping in? It's out there. Why should I care? Just don't worry about it, sort of thing. Yeah.
I think it's about recognizing the impact and the damage that the data can have, and we're seeing the impacts of data breaches from years ago. We still see those, and you see stories of haunting certain citizens from data breaches. So we won't necessarily know the impacts of some of the data breaches from last year for some time, and some of them we see immediately. So I think it's understanding that and constantly reinforcing that it's a national issue. At all levels, from businesses to individuals to governments. Going to Kylie's point is about questioning why data is being collected and stored, and why is it being collected and where is it being stored, as well as sort of contextualising the impacts that data can have if put in the wrong hands. Will go some way to helping that complacency. But I suppose the flip side of it is that if we see more data breaches, I think there will start that little bit of normality will start to creep in. So I think the other side of it is to harden our networks, so we stop seeing so many companies being breached.
It's a really good point, actually, Alan, isn't it? Because if the point you said that we're not going to see the effects potentially for months or a year or whatever after the actual breach has happened. So do you think there's a need to almost sort of have extended sort of communication sort of channels in place, if that makes sense? Because obviously I'm sure like everybody here, I was victim of one of those breaches, right? But you get nothing, you get the initial communication. So do we need to keep communicating? I mean, how long do we communicate?
Yeah, I think, there's a role for everybody here, and there's a role in obviously the identity players, so the state governments and the federal governments who own identity documents there. There's a role for the businesses themselves who are collecting the data. So I think that constant education needs to be, and awareness needs to be joined up between industry and government to make sure that those risks are being managed. And it comes down to what that data is, and some of those data sets can't be changed easily. And further work, I think, needs to be done to address some of those issues.
Okay. Kylie, I'd love to get some thoughts. If I think about, this whole conversation around awareness, there's no sort of one size fits all here. You can be a 100,000 person organization, a 2-person sort of mom and pop shop, that kind of thing, or you can be a citizen or a CIO or CISO. Are there any areas you think we really need to double down on, if you like, in terms of raising awareness? So they're kind of some sort of, I think, black holes, if you like, which we need to sort of pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps no one from these organisations is represented here, but I do think major health organisations from the not-for-profit angle, faith-based organisations, particularly a concern. I do know a doctor that has 5 different practices who just pays his $80K a year in ransomware because it's cheaper than putting a CIO or a CISO on, right? And they seem to know, every year, I think it went up to 90 last year. So they're paying it, right? They're out there and it's cheaper for them to pay it and just put it to one side and budget it. And that's a real concern because that's, one doctor with 5 practices. Can you imagine how many more are out there? And then you think about the faith-based or the other healthcare, not-for-profit. If you're cancer, diabetes, heart, whatever it is, you're potentially collecting really personal information about people. And so, it's very similar to the breaches we saw last year. If that gets released, quite sensitive. And most of them would fail any sort of NIST assessment immediately or PSPF, right? So they don't have the assets, they don't have the resources to be able to strengthen themselves against, these attacks. So that worries me considerably.
All right, great. So just doubling down a bit, Tom, on some of the sort of, I guess, state-based actors, if you like, always a challenge for us, of course. And we've heard obviously about the axis of evil back in the day. Now we've got the if you like, the threat axis of cyber. We talked about Iran, Korea, Russia, for example. But what can we learn from them, right? So they're a threat to us. We see Ukraine being hammered all the time by Russia at the moment. Are there things that we can actually learn from what's going on out there to prepare ourselves better?
Yeah, absolutely. You should throw China in there too in that axis of it.
I miss China.
Yeah.
Course, that's right.
I never fail to name China and those things. So there's a lot to learn. Like, for instance, if you go to, at the moment, the reason Robert's not here, Robert Potter, is because he's in Ukraine. He's in Kyiv, and he's we're assisting as a company, the Ukrainian government in their fight against the Russian cyber attacks. And there's actually a lot to learn from them. And we find, while we're supposedly doing training, in fact, it's like the boy said to me yesterday, it's actually a room full of peers. Like, you go in there, you're not really training people, you're just exchanging ideas. And they are at the very front line. Ukraine is at the very front line of cyber warfare and its conjunction with kinetic warfare. And so we are learning a lot, and we hope to be able to bring that back to not just ransomware, but critical infrastructure attacks, all of that sort of thing, and be able to disseminate that into Australia. Okay,
good stuff. Great, excellent. Interesting job out there at the moment in Kyiv, I'd imagine. Some of the things.
Actually, Kyiv's a great city. Yeah. I can't wait to go back.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really good.
All right. So we're getting towards the end of time, but I just want to come around the virtual sort of table here. Alan, I'll start with you. Talked about a lot of things here today. Obviously, we've seen a lot of stats as well during the morning. If you could, give the team here one piece of advice or one area they should take a bit more seriously, what would that one thing be?
I mean, I say this probably at a few other things, and I think for people here, pick 3 scenarios that you're the most concerned about. those scenarios could be ones that make the most disruption to your business based on likelihood and consequence, and exercise how you'd respond to those scenarios. That's kind of it. I think I've done that previously, and people have been surprised from what 3 scenarios they actually pick.
Okay, and be ready for that response.
Absolutely,
right? It's absolutely critical. Tom, what about from your point of view? What's the one thing you'd like the team to sort of take a little bit more focus on?
I can only echo Alan: planning and exercise. Like actually being really aware of what it is that is your biggest threats, and how will you respond to them in the event that they happen. It just calms you down when that actually happens.
Okay, so when you think about the respond piece as well, what does sort of good look like to you? Do you think, Tom?
You're well out of my area of competence now. Look, I think the biggest piece that's been raised by the other two previously as well today is the communication, not just internally and not just the technical response, but how do you communicate what has happened and what you're doing about it to your customers and to the wider population.
Okay, respond and communicate. Yeah. Kylie, what about from your point of view? What do you like the team to take away today?
Yeah, I think along the same theme, I've seen a CIO actually go out there and wire everything to say, it's going to be a nation state actor that we're going to prepare against. And actually, when they had an attack occur, it was a competitor. So really check your biases, check where you think the threats are coming from, and make sure that you're not absolutely aligned to just having everything profiled against that one particular actor. Pick the 3, as Alan just mentioned there. So really be aware of that and your biases in it.